DEI is so toxic that we are literally funding hatred. We are funding, it's this taxpayer-funded hate. And international communism spent decades trying to poison this country. And DEI has done more damage than international communism has in just 4 years.
The debate over diversity, equity, and inclusion has reached a critical breaking point. Sweeping executive orders threaten to dismantle established DEI programs. The conversation has shifted dramatically from supporting diversity to questioning its implementation. Institutions across the country are scrambling to respond to these unprecedented changes.
The scope of this order is huge, really dramatic change, not only for government contractors, but for all private sector corporations.
And Trump notably revoked the executive order signed by LBJ back in 1965, which prohibited discriminatory practices in employment decisions for federal contractors. What sort of immediate impact could we start to see?
So the president, as you said, revoked the 1965 executive order from President Johnson and has flipped the requirements so that government contractors now have to agree not to engage in any sort of DEI program that has a preference based on race or gender.
The legal landscape of workplace diversity is undergoing a radical transformation. Decades-old civil rights protections are being reinterpreted and challenged. The executive order represents a fundamental shift in how employment practices are understood. Lawyers and policy experts are closely analyzing the potential long-term implications.
Is DEI really DOA? Well, as of 2 hours ago, all federal employees in DEI roles, that's a lot of federal employees, have been put on leave, and the woke offices that they were in are now closed. That's thanks to Trump's sweeping executive orders. I love this. It's like Christmas every day. And this means over at the FAA, which only runs our air traffic control, guess what? This was removed from its website. We believe diversity is needed to ensure multiple perspectives are at the table, guarantee safety is a priority, and promote a healthy work environment. Shouldn't air traffic controllers just be good at their job? Doesn't matter what gender, sex, sexual orientation.
Federal agencies are experiencing immediate and dramatic changes to their workforce policies. Diversity statements are being stripped from official communications. The focus is shifting exclusively to job performance and technical competence. Critical infrastructure organizations are re-examining their hiring and management practices.
And I don't mean the people who didn't get the job because they weren't the right skin color, but the people who got the jobs. They're always going to be viewed with suspicion that they're examples of preferential treatment. We've talked about that. But there's also another thing, and I've seen this happen everywhere. You could be a great hire in the future, but if you're not ready for the job when they put you in there, you will collapse and you will lose that opportunity. If you give somebody too much too soon, the person will always fail.
The psychological impact of diversity hiring practices is coming under intense scrutiny. Concerns about perceived tokenism are gaining mainstream attention. The debate centers on whether well-intentioned diversity efforts might inadvertently harm career trajectories. Critics argue that premature promotions can create long-term professional challenges.
Yeah, his executive orders on day one and day two do a couple things. One, they rescind all of Biden's executive orders entrenching DEI into bureaucracy. But what happened last night was even more significant. His executive order actually instructs his administration to investigate corporations, schools, and universities for practicing DEI. And it says if you're practicing illegal and discriminatory DEI in the private sector and you receive federal funds, you'll be under investigation. You'll pay a huge price. This is sending shockwaves through virtually every major institution in the country.
The investigation of DEI practices is expanding beyond government agencies. Private sector institutions are now under unprecedented scrutiny. The executive order creates a mechanism for systematic review of diversity programs. Companies are reassessing their approach to workplace inclusivity.
So, Lindsay, the most dramatic thing about that is the president literally asked the heads of every federal agency to provide a list of 9 targets against whom they will initiate investigations and potential litigation to challenge private sector diversity programs that they believe are unlawful. So each agency is going to be on the hunt and it's the mission is find the biggest whales you can. The executive order says look for large publicly traded corporations, large employers, large foundations, and send these lists to the White House so that the agencies can initiate investigations and litigation.
Federal agencies are being transformed into active investigators of diversity practices. The approach is strategic and targeted, focusing on high-profile institutions. Large corporations and foundations are particularly at risk. The White House is creating a centralized system to track and potentially challenge DEI programs.
60% of the federal workforce is white. Guess what the percentage of white Americans are? 60%. Accurately reflects the demographics of the country. What is the percentage of black Americans in the federal government? 18%. What's the percentage in the population? 14%. So the black Americans are actually overrepresented in the federal government, and white Americans equally represented as a proportion to the population.
Demographic data is being used to challenge existing diversity narratives. The current federal workforce is being analyzed through a statistical lens. Representation is being reframed as a mathematical equation rather than a social justice initiative. These numbers are becoming a key argument in the anti-DEI movement.
They do want the best of the best.
That's exactly right. I was texting with a number of tech CEOs down in Silicon Valley. They told me that the resistance against Trump is dead. That, in fact, many executives and managers at these companies are relieved they don't have to pretend to believe in DEI and woke and, tampons in the men's bathroom. One executive told me he used to collect the men's tampons at all the conferences at these Silicon Valley companies because it's so ridiculous. He doesn't have to do that anymore. The tampons are out of the men's room at Facebook and other companies.
Corporate attitudes towards DEI are undergoing a radical transformation. Silicon Valley is reportedly embracing a more merit-based approach. The performative aspects of diversity programs are being openly mocked and dismantled. Executives are signaling a return to what they perceive as more traditional hiring practices.
Sometimes I think either intentionally or unintentionally or inadvertently seem to suggest that there are people who are being promoted or given an opportunity when they don't have the ability or the qualifications for the job. I'm sure that happens in some instances. And then I think some people who are opponents of DEI begin to extrapolate that women and blacks and Hispanics and whomever should have had that job, and we should look at those people for jobs because there's a presumption they're not qualified.
The nuances of the DEI debate are becoming increasingly complex. There's a recognition of both intentional and unintentional biases in hiring practices. The conversation is wrestling with the line between addressing systemic inequalities and maintaining professional standards. Critics are careful to distinguish between challenging specific diversity initiatives and broader questions of workplace equality.
What I'd hate to do is for us not to realize that before you had DEI and affirmative action, we were not a merit-based society. I mean, blacks and women were discriminated against because of the fact they were blacks and women and Hispanics.
You mean before DEI?
Before affirmative action. DEI is a 3 or 4 year old program.
Yeah, I know that.
But I said affirmative action.
When did affirmative action start?
So the Bakke decision is what gave it to us.
What year was that?
I think it was in the mid-'60s, Judge.
Okay.
Mid to late 60s.
Right.
So before that, remember, the country didn't have a great history of these things. My only point
It was
is...
outlawed. Discrimination was outlawed.
Yeah.
I mean,
Historical context is providing critical perspective on the current debate. The conversation acknowledges the historical roots of workplace discrimination. There's a recognition that previous hiring practices were deeply unjust and exclusionary. The current dismantling of DEI is being viewed through the lens of historical systemic inequalities. Our exploration of the DEI debate revealed a complex narrative of institutional change. We uncovered fundamental tensions between diversity goals and meritocratic principles. The discussion highlighted deep disagreements about workplace equality, representation, and competence. These conversations reflect broader societal debates about opportunity, fairness, and professional advancement.
Merit.
All right, guys.
And people got to be given an opportunity
remember
to show their
Merit, the
merit.
cigarette?
Yeah,
Yes, all right.
What a weird name for cigarettes.
I do.
Merit.
Merit.
What do you think? Is this the end of DEI or the beginning of a more nuanced conversation about true workplace equality?